Welcome. You're inside the Colmar Minute, where we address issues of governance, leadership, and institutional performance, one observation precisely stated. Today's observation is that you are governing the wrong function. Now, last week we touched on the difference between a function that is staffed and one that is governed. This week, I want to name something more specific: the frameworks HR departments use to govern administrative leadership. Now, let me preface that by saying these were built for a version of the role that no longer exists. Now, the role has changed over time, but the frameworks have not kept up. And that gap between what the framework assumes and what the function actually carries is where the institutional cost lives. So it's not just that the function is ungoverned, it is that the governance framework being applied is the wrong one entirely, because administrative leadership, as it operates, sits at the intersection of executive authority and institutional execution. It manages access, continuity, priority, and information at the level that is closest to the principal. Now, that function influences what gets acted upon, when, and by whom, without holding any formal decision authority in itself. So, that is not a support function. It is one of the most important functions within an organization, and yet it is being governed as if it is not. And when you govern it as support, you end up measuring the wrong things, which leads us to examine where institutions begin when designing the role. Now, they begin with a question. When HR sits down to design the administrative leadership role, the questions they ask is, what is this person going to do? And the focus is on what tasks will they handle and what systems will they manage. And that's a reasonable question, but it's not the right one. The right question is, what does the institution need this function to ensure? Now, the focus shifts, if you'd notice, on not what the person is doing, but what the institution must be able to depend on them to maintain. And those two questions produce very different role designs and very different outcomes when something goes wrong. Now, when the function fails, and the first question you ask is, who failed? Obviously, the institution would correct a person. Now, when the first question asked is what condition is missing, the institution has an opportunity to correct a structure. Now, one of those responses fixes the problem, while the other one replaces a person and waits for the problem to return. And here is where it shows up most clearly in how institutions evaluate the function. Now, most HR frameworks measure outputs: how many requests were fulfilled, how quickly, how accurately, and on paper, those numbers would look fine on a performance appraisal. But consider this: an administrative professional can fulfill every single request with perfect timeliness and accuracy, while the leader they're supporting is drowned in, absorbing coordination burdens every day. And we spoke about it a few weeks ago, and we called it coordination fatigue or exhaustion, where the leader spends most of their time on follow through. Now, by current frameworks, that administrative professional is a high performer and will score high on a performance appraisal. But by the standard that actually matters, leadership capacity is not being preserved, priorities are slipping, the institution is not moving, and the function is failing. Not the person, it's just that the conditions that should define success were never established. And that is what happens when you design a role around tasks instead of conditions. And I sound like a broken record, you end up measuring the wrong things. And you don't see the cost until it becomes too huge to ignore. Now, the full essay, You Are Governing the Wrong Function, can be found on my website, thecolmargrouplimited.com. The link would be in the description below. I encourage you to read it because the conversation has so much more to it. I look forward to seeing you next Monday morning. I'm Ambassador Yolan Smith, and you have been inside the Colmar Minute.